Men are walking away and they are not coming back. Nothing can heal this broken dynamic between men and women in the West. The damage runs so deep that relationships and marriage have become something most men view as a straight up trap they refuse to step into ever again. Listen up, because this is the raw truth that a lot of people do not want to hear, but need to face head on. For decades, men were told they were the root of every problem in society and in relationships. They were constantly fed the idea that they needed to change more, do more, provide more, listen more, and worship women who were placed on this untouchable pedestal as the fairer sex without any real explanation why that label stuck or what it actually meant in practice. Men were gaslit into thinking they were inferior or at best equal in a way that always left women holding the superior position in the cultural narrative. They heard endless lectures about toxic masculinity and how they had to suppress their natural instincts to make room for female empowerment at every turn. But after years of that constant pressure and self hatred being spoon fed from every direction, something finally snapped. Men looked around, saw the deep flaws on the other side of the equation, realized they were not the sole villains in the story, and decided enough was enough. They discovered that relationships demanded equal compromise, not one sided, endless sacrifice to keep someone else happy. They figured out that arguing with a woman often meant clashing against raw emotion rather than shared logic and facts, because feelings tend to override everything else in those exchanges. Women might cry to release stress and even find some relief or enjoyment in it, while men typically only cry when something is genuinely broken and they hate the experience because it leaves them drained. In every disagreement, the dynamic often ends with her feeling energized and validated while he walks away exhausted and humiliated. Men got tired of the rhetoric that painted them as the constant problem. They stopped trying to please a system and a culture that showed little respect or care in return. Instead, they walked away, found real peace in their own company, and they have zero intention of going back to the old game. This shift did not happen overnight, but it built steadily as men started connecting the dots on their own experiences and the broader patterns playing out around them. They saw how women were elevated while men were told to shrink themselves and take all the blame. They watched as public spaces, gyms, coffee shops, bars, bookstores, and workplaces became battlegrounds where men felt constantly policed for simply existing as men through movements and campaigns that framed normal male behavior as some kind of threat. Things like Me Too were initially presented as necessary, but quickly turned into tools that punished men broadly and created an atmosphere of fear where any interaction could be twisted into an accusation. Feminism pushed hard for women to dominate certain narratives and spaces, while men were expected to just accept it and keep contributing without complaint. But men did not fight back with anger or loud protests in most cases. They did something far more powerful and permanent. They simply stopped showing up. They abandoned the arenas where they felt unwelcome or undervalued and retreated into solitude where they could control their own energy time and resources without constant drain. Now that hard economic realities are hitting with high inflation squeezing budgets and society showing cracks, women are starting to feel the absence of men in very tangible ways. They traded reliable male provision and partnership for dependence on the state and corporate structures, but those systems are straining under their own weight and failing to deliver the security that was promised. Women pushed men aside in the workforce and social scenes for decades, using every cultural weapon available, and men responded not by arguing, but by disappearing from the equation altogether. They discovered that life without the drama and one sided expectations brought genuine calm and focus. Women now face tougher times economically, and they are calling for men to return, save the day, have children, and rebuild what was torn down during the boss babe years that delivered far less fulfillment than advertised. But men are not looking back. They have tasted real peace in their own space and they like it there. The core of this break comes down to trust that has been completely scorched. Women weaponized sex, turning what should be a mutual, enjoyable part of connection into something men now see more as a potential liability full of risks than a natural reward. Many men report that their desire for it has faded because the surrounding context made it feel dangerous rather than freeing. They look at the landscape and see a scorched earth where demands for commitment come without matching accountability or reciprocity. Women continue to act as if nothing fundamental changed, demanding men step up like in the old days, while ignoring how their own choices and cultural shifts burned the bridge. It is like they are dancing in the ashes and then wondering why no one wants to join the party and rebuild the house. Polls have shown millions of women saying they would rather encounter a bear in the woods than a man. And men have responded with a straightforward message: let the bear handle it. Go hang out with those forest creatures because we are good right where we are. This time, there is no rescue coming from the male side. The relationship between men and women in Western society is effectively dead and buried for this generation and likely beyond. In the rare cases where a man still seeks companionship, he looks overseas to places in Asia, South America, or Eastern Europe where women often retain more traditional values, raised to be supportive wives and mothers who bring femininity, agreeableness, and fitness to the table without the heavy layers of entitlement or combativeness. Those matches can work because the foundation has not been poisoned by decades of mutual distrust. But back home in the West, the well is dry. There is no trust left to rebuild on, and no amount of surface level fixes will change that in our lifetime. To understand how we got here, it helps to walk through the long chain of events and mindset shifts that led men to this point of total disengagement. Start with the cultural programming that began decades ago. Society told men they were privileged oppressors who needed to atone by stepping back and letting women lead in more areas. Schools, workplaces, media, and entertainment all reinforce the idea that male traits like competitiveness, stoicism, and directness were problems to be fixed rather than strengths to be channeled. Boys grew up hearing they had to be more sensitive, more emotional, more in touch with their feelings in ways that often clashed with their natural wiring. At the same time, girls were encouraged to be strong, independent, and ambitious without much emphasis on the trade offs or the importance of partnership and family building in a balanced way. This created a generation where women entered adulthood expecting to have it all on their terms, while men entered with a built in sense of guilt and the need to prove they were not part of the problem. Over time, that guilt turned into exhaustion. Men worked hard, provided financially, and tried to navigate the shifting rules, only to find that their efforts were met with criticism rather than appreciation. If they succeeded, they were told it was because of systemic advantages. If they struggled, they were told they needed to do better and try harder. There was rarely acknowledgement that both sides brought flaws and that healthy relationships require mutual respect and compromise instead of one party constantly bending. And as dating entered the picture, the imbalances became even clearer. Men were expected to initiate, pursue, plan, and pay, in most cases, while facing rejection or judgment if they did not meet ever rising standards shaped by social media and unlimited options. Apps amplified this turning connection into a marketplace where women received floods of attention and men competed in a numbers game that drained time and confidence. Many men poured energy into profiles, messages, and dates only to encounter ghosting flakiness or last minute changes that showed little regard for their investment. The constant starting over after short lived connections added another layer of fatigue. Relationships that lasted a year or two would end, and the whole process of courting and building from scratch had to begin again with no guarantee of better results. Men in survival mode, just trying to cover rent, food, and basic stability, found they had nothing left for that kind of repeated effort, especially when the rewards felt uncertain and the risk of emotional or financial fallout loomed large. They started calculating the cost benefit, and the math simply did not add up for a lot of them. Why chase something that often left them feeling used, drained, or disposable when solitude offered control peace and the ability to direct their resources toward their own goals and hobbies? This calculation grew sharper as men observed the patterns in marriage and long term commitment. Divorce rates stayed high, with outcomes that frequently left men losing assets, custody time with children, and financial stability, while women received protections and advantages through the family court system. Stories circulated of men who worked hard, built a life only to see it dismantled after a split where the narrative favored the woman, regardless of who initiated the end. False accusations in domestic matters or harassment claims added another risk factor that made even casual approaches feel like walking through a minefield. Men heard women celebrate strength and independence, but then watched those same women struggle when real life demands like home maintenance, emotional support, or financial pressures hit without a partner to share the load. The message from the culture had been, you do not need a man, until the moment when it became clear that going it alone came with its own heavy burdens. Men listened to the earlier declarations of independence and took them at face value. They stopped offering the traditional roles and instead focused on self reliance. They built their lives around fitness, career, side pursuits, and male friendships that provided camaraderie without the complications. In that space, they found they could breathe easier without the weight of constant performance to meet someone else's checklist. Women on the other side started noticing the shift when their usual strategies stopped working. The attention that flowed freely in their younger years slowed down. Options that once seemed endless narrowed as they aged and as men collectively lowered their investment in the pursuit game. Many women had spent their prime years exploring casual connections, career climbing, or personal freedom under the banner of empowerment, only to reach their 30s or 40s and realize the landscape had changed. Biological realities around fertility and the dating market dynamics, where men often retain or even gain appeal with age, while women face steeper declines in perceived options, created a painful wake up. They saw friends pairing off, having families, and building stability, while their own paths left them with independence, but also quiet evenings full of unshared burdens. Some expressed the weight of carrying life alone, the desire for someone to lean on or simply hold space with during tough times. Yet, when they looked for partners, they often brought forward the same high expectations without adjusting for the new reality where men were no longer willing to chase or prove themselves endlessly. The complaints about men not approaching, not putting in effort, or not committing rang hollow to many guys who had already decided the game was rigged against them. Men had adapted by refusing to play at all. They chose peace over potential chaos, and that choice stuck because it delivered real results in their daily lives. The economic angle makes this even more sobering. Inflation has driven up the cost of living, making basic survival harder for everyone, but particularly noticeable for those who relied on dual income models or male provision as a safety net. Women who traded traditional partnership for state support or corporate careers found those backups less reliable when budgets tightened and opportunities shifted. Childcare costs, housing, and general expenses added pressure that a single income or government aid could not fully cover in the way a committed partnership once did. Men watched this unfold and felt no urge to jump back in as the savior figure. They had been told for years that their role as provider was outdated or oppressive, so they internalized that and redirected their earnings toward their own security instead of risking it in a system that offered little protection. They saw women demanding equality in some areas, like paying for dates or splitting bills, but still expecting chivalry and traditional gestures in others. The inconsistency frustrated them and reinforced the decision to opt out. Why fund someone else's lifestyle or hot girl phase when that energy could build personal wealth freedom and hobbies that actually brought satisfaction? Many men reached a point where even the physical side of relationships lost its pull because the context turned it into something transactional or risky rather than mutually enjoyable and bonding. This disengagement shows up in everyday behaviors. Men spend less time in mixed social settings where approaches once happened naturally. They avoid bars, clubs, and certain public spaces not out of fear exactly, but out of a clear eyed assessment that the potential downside outweighs any upside. They focus on gyms that cater more to serious training home setups or male dominated hobbies where they can enjoy camaraderie without navigating mixed signals or heightened sensitivities. In workplaces, they keep interactions professional and minimal to avoid any misinterpretation that could lead to complaints or drama. The result is a quieter withdrawal that leaves women wondering where all the interested men went. But from the male perspective, it feels like a logical retreat to preserve sanity and resources. They have seen enough examples of relationships that started with promise, only to devolve into power struggles, constant testing, or emotional labor that went unreciprocated. They understand now that arguments often follow emotional logic rather than factual exchange, leaving one side drained while the other feels empowered. Men do not enjoy that cycle, and they have chosen to break it by removing themselves from it entirely. Looking deeper into the cultural roots reveals how feminism played a significant role in reshaping expectations without fully accounting for the human cost on both sides. It pushed women toward career and independence as the highest goods while downplaying the value of family formation and partnership. It framed men as obstacles or beneficiaries of unfair systems rather than partners with their own valid needs and strengths. Over generations, this created women who valued autonomy above connection and men who learned to guard their autonomy fiercely in response. The movement highlighted real inequalities from earlier eras, but in correcting them, it often swung too far, creating new imbalances. Women gained more opportunities in education and work, which was positive in many ways, but the accompanying cultural narrative sometimes discouraged the softer skills of nurturing compromise and long term commitment that make relationships thrive. Men absorb messages that their provider instincts were outdated or suspect, so they dialed those back and focused inward. The sexual revolution added another layer by decoupling intimacy from commitment in ways that benefited short term exploration, but left many with emotional scars and trust issues that carried into later years. Women who engaged heavily in casual dynamics sometimes found it harder to shift into serious partnership mode later, while men grew wary of investing deeply when the foundation seemed unstable. These shifts compounded over time until the breaking point where men as a group said no more and walked off the field. The loneliness that some women report now stems from this long divergence. They built lives around self sufficiency and personal achievement, which delivered freedom and accomplishments, but left gaps in daily emotional support and shared purpose. The quiet moments at home after work or on weekends hit differently when there is no consistent partner to debrief with or plan with. Friends who once filled social calendars start pairing off and prioritizing their own families, leaving single women feeling like outliers in their circles. The independence that solved certain practical problems did not address the deeper human need for intimate connection and mutual reliance. When that realization hits, it can feel heavy, especially if past choices involved delaying family or overlooking compatible partners in favor of more exciting but unstable options. Men, on the other hand, report lower levels of that particular loneliness because many have cultivated rich inner lives, male friendships, and personal routines that fulfill them without the relational overhead. They do not carry the same societal pressure to define their worth through partnership, and they have adapted by finding satisfaction in autonomy. This difference highlights how the cultural messages landed unevenly, with women encouraged to need no one and men quietly learning to need no one in return. Economically, the picture grows starker as inflation and shifting job markets squeeze household budgets. Women who counted on dual incomes or male breadwinning to maintain lifestyles find themselves facing harder choices when those elements are absent. Raising children alone or managing a home without shared labor adds physical and mental strain that becomes more evident over time. The state systems meant to provide backup show their limits when demand rises and resources stretch thin. Men see this and feel no compulsion to re enter as the fix it solution because they absorb the lessons of the past decades too well. They were told their traditional roles were problematic, so they let go of them and built alternatives that protect their peace and finances. They refuse to be walking ATMs or emotional support animals in setups that offer little security for their own futures. Instead, they invest in skills, assets, and experiences that compound for their benefit alone. This self focused approach gives them stability that feels earned and controllable rather than dependent on someone else's shifting moods or demands. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. The hard hitting reality at the center of all this is that the trust has evaporated, and without it, no amount of surface appeals or economic pressure will bring men back in meaningful numbers. Women scorched the relational landscape with movements and attitudes that prioritize short term gains or ideological wins over long term mutual thriving. They pushed men out of shared spaces and narratives, then expressed surprise when men stopped participating. Now, with winter arriving in the form of economic strain and demographic shifts, they call for men to return, but the response is silence or a simple no thanks. Men have found something better in their solitude. They have rebuilt their days around purpose without the constant negotiation or risk of being cast as the villain. In the few cases where they seek connection, they look for women from cultures that did not absorb the same toxic programming, women who value femininity support and family roles without the combativeness or entitlement that became normalized here. Those cross cultural matches can succeed because the expectations align more closely with traditional complementarity rather than enforced sameness or superiority contests. But domestically, the divide feels permanent. The generations coming up have witnessed the fallout, and many young men are internalizing the lesson early, choosing self development over risky entanglements. This is not about hatred or bitterness from the male side. It is a clear eyed assessment of costs versus benefits in a landscape that changed dramatically. Men tried the old path, followed the scripts, and found them lacking in reciprocity and safety. They adapted by withdrawing, and the peace they discovered reinforced the choice. Women face the consequences of their collective decisions, whether through delayed family building, career focused lifestyles, or cultural messages that devalued male contributions. The loneliness epidemic on their side is real, but it stems from patterns that were encouraged and celebrated for years. Men are not obligated to fix it, especially after being told repeatedly that they were the problem. The sobering truth is that both sides contributed to the break, but the male response of walking away has proven more sustainable for their well being. Society as a whole feels the ripple effects in lower birth rates, strained social structures, and shifting economic dynamics. But the individual men who made the choice report higher satisfaction in their daily lives, free from the old pressures. Continuing this narrative requires acknowledging the full weight of how arguments and emotional dynamics play out differently. Women often process stress through verbal expression and emotional release, which can leave them feeling lighter after a conflict. Men tend to internalize or seek solutions, and when the exchange stays in the realm of feelings rather than facts, it leaves them depleted without resolution. This mismatch turns many interactions into exhausting cycles where one side gains energy while the other loses it. Men grew tired of always being positioned as the one who must adjust or apologize first. They saw how logic and evidence often took a back seat to emotional validation and decided they no longer wanted to participate in setups where winning was impossible by design. Instead, they stepped back and invested that energy into pursuits that delivered tangible results like career advancement, physical health, or skill building. The solitude allowed them to recharge on their own terms without the drain of constant emotional labor. Public spaces transformed under these pressures as well. Gyms that once mixed genders comfortably became sites of tension, with complaints about staring or manspreading turning normal behavior into accusations. Coffee shops and bookstores saw men reduce their time there to avoid any perception of intrusion. Bars and social venues lost male presence because the risk of misinterpretation or outright rejection with attitude made the outing not worth it. Men did not protest loudly. They just found alternatives like home gyms, online communities, or male only activities where they could relax without filters. This withdrawal created echo chambers on the female side, where complaints about lack of approaches or effort grew louder but without self reflection on how the environment had been made hostile to male initiative. Men heard the calls to leave women alone and they complied fully. They took the independence message seriously and built lives that no longer centered on female validation or pursuit. The economic hardships now hitting women harder in some demographics underscore the imbalance. Single motherhood or delayed family formation carries costs that compound with inflation in housing, food, and childcare. Careers that promised fulfillment sometimes delivered isolation when the social fabric of partnership was missing. Men who once filled provider and protector roles stepped away, and the void became noticeable. Yet the call for them to return comes without the accountability or changes that would make re-engagement appealing. Men see the pattern and stay firm in their decision. They have peace, they have control, and they have no desire to trade it for a system that previously offered little protection or appreciation. The rare man who still wants traditional companionship looks abroad, where values around family and gender roles have not been as thoroughly disrupted. There, women often bring traits like agreeableness, femininity, and a focus on wife and mother roles that align with what many men seek without the Western layers of suspicion or demands for constant performance. Those relationships can rebuild trust because they start from a different cultural foundation, untainted by decades of adversarial messaging. This permanent break in the West carries implications for everyone. Birth rates continue to drop as fewer men commit to family formation under current conditions. Social structures that relied on stable pairings face strain. Economic models assuming dual contributions or male provision adjust to new realities where men prioritize self sufficiency. Women who reach later stages of life with regrets about past choices find fewer options as the market shifts toward younger or foreign matches for the men who still participate. The independence that was sold as liberation delivered freedom in some areas, but loneliness and practical burdens in others. Men who walked away report the opposite. They gained time, energy, and mental space that translates into better focus and contentment. The sobering wake up call is that actions have consequences, and the collective choices made over decades created a divide that will not close easily. Men are not angry in the destructive sense, they are resolved. They have seen the flaws, the risks, and the lack of reciprocity, and they chose solitude as the healthier path. Women face their own reckoning with the outcomes of empowerment without balance, and many are only now feeling the full weight of what was traded away. The storytelling of how this unfolded shows a steady progression from cultural critique to behavioral change. Early waves of feminism highlighted legitimate issues and opened doors, but later, iterations framed men as inherent problems rather than partners. Media and education reinforced narratives that celebrated female strength while questioning male value. Dating culture shifted toward casual exploration, enabled by technology that gave women more choices and men more rejection fatigue. Economic pressures mounted as living costs rose and wages stagnated for many, leaving less room for the extras that courtship once involved. Legal frameworks around family and harassment added risk that made commitment feel like a gamble with loaded dice. Men absorbed all of it, processed the patterns, and made the rational decision to disengage. They did not need dramatic manifestos or protests. Their quiet exit spoke volumes, and the results in their personal lives confirmed it was the right move. Peace replaced pressure, self respect replaced self doubt, and focus replaced fragmentation. This is the new normal, and it shows no signs of reversing because the underlying conditions that caused it remain in place. As the years pass, the divide deepens. Young men entering adulthood see the examples from older generations, and many choose similar paths of caution and self investment. They watch relationships around them falter under unrealistic expectations or emotional imbalances, and they decide early to protect their own futures. They build skills, networks, and habits that serve them independently. Dating becomes optional rather than a default life stage. Marriage looks like a high risk contract rather than a natural step. This mindset spreads through observation and shared experiences rather than organized movements. Women, on their side, navigate a market where male initiative has dropped and options feel thinner, especially past certain ages. The biological clock and shifting priorities create urgency that clashes with the earlier messages of endless time and unlimited choice. Some adapt by lowering demands or reflecting on past patterns, but many cling to the old scripts, wondering why the response is so muted. The truth is, men have moved on literally and figuratively. They found value in their own company and they guard it fiercely because it delivers what the old dynamic no longer could consistency respect for their energy and freedom from unnecessary drama. This reality serves as a wake up for anyone paying attention. The relationship between men and women in Western society crossed a point of no easy return. Trust eroded through years of one sided narratives, risk accumulation, and lack of mutual accountability. Men walked away, not in defeat, but in strategic retreat towards something better for them. They discovered solitude brings clarity, purpose, and calm that chaotic pursuit never matched. Women face the downstream effects of cultural shifts that promised empowerment but delivered isolation in key areas. The economic squeeze highlights the practical costs of going it alone when shared labor and provision once lightened the load. Overseas options for men who still seek partnership show that the problem is regional, rooted in specific Western developments rather than universal. The scorched earth approach left ashes, and men have no interest in replanting on that soil. They prefer their own cultivated gardens of peace and self direction. This is the straightforward truth without sugarcoating. The damage is done. The exit is complete, and the future looks like continued separation rather than reconciliation in our lifetime. The intensity of this shift becomes clearer when examining how arguments and daily interactions evolved. Women often use emotional framing to express needs or frustrations, which can energize them through the process of being heard. Men prefer fact based resolution, and when that is sidelined, they leave conversations feeling depleted and unfulfilled. Over time, the pattern of losing every exchange, not because of weaker logic, but because of mismatched styles, wore men down. They stopped engaging in those loops and redirected their mental resources elsewhere. Public interactions followed the same logic. Fear of misinterpretation or accusations made even neutral approaches feel loaded. Men chose avoidance over risk, and the social fabric adjusted accordingly with fewer mixed gender casual encounters. Gyms, coffee shops, and other venues saw male presence decline as men opted for controlled environments or solo routines. This was not cowardice, it was calculated self preservation based on observed outcomes. Women expressed confusion at the lack of approaches, but the groundwork for that silence had been laid by years of framing male initiative as potential threat or burden. Men listened and complied by removing themselves from the equation. Economic factors sealed the decision for many. Dating and relationships carry hidden costs in time, money, and opportunity that men in survival or building mode can no longer justify. Inflation makes every expense heavier, and men see no reason to allocate resources toward setups that offer uncertain returns and high downside. They watch peers lose assets or stability in splits, and they chose to keep what they earned for their own security. The provider role that once defined much of male identity was critiqued as outdated, so men released it and focused on personal provision instead. This protects them from being viewed as walking wallets or emotional crutches. They build wealth, fitness, and knowledge that compound without external drama. The peace they gain reinforces the choice daily. Solitude allows recovery, focus, and enjoyment on their terms without the need to constantly negotiate or perform. Many report that even physical intimacy lost appeal when it came wrapped in liability or transactional expectations. The weaponization turned a natural drive into something men approach with caution or avoid altogether. They found other outlets or simply let the desire fade in favor of mental clarity. The hard conclusion that echoes through all of this is simple and final. Men are done and they mean it. The relationship as it existed in the West is over. No amount of economic pressure or late appeals will reverse the collective decision because the foundation of trust and reciprocity was destroyed. Women scorched the field and now stand in the ashes demanding restoration, but men have built new lives elsewhere. They found peace in walking away, and they guard it. For those rare men still open to connection, the search goes global to cultures that preserve more balanced gender dynamics. In the West, the divide stands as a monument to decades of imbalance. This is the sobering reality that people need to face without delusion. The damage cannot be undone quickly, and men have no plan to return. They have moved forward into solitude and self mastery, and that path suits them. The story of how we arrived here is one of gradual erosion through cultural messaging, legal risks, economic shifts, and emotional mismatches. Each layer added weight until men simply stepped off the scale. Their exit was quiet, but its effects are loud in the changing social and economic landscape. This is the truth, straight and unfiltered. Men walked away, and the West is living with the permanent consequences. Men observed how the system around dating and family life stacked risks against them in ways that made participation feel like signing up for potential disaster. Family courts frequently handed down outcomes where assets built over years of hard work got divided with little regard for the contributions or future stability of the man involved. Child custody arrangements often defaulted in patterns that limited fathers' time and influence while imposing ongoing financial obligations that stretched budgets thin even during tough economic periods. Men watched peers go through these processes and saw lives dismantled not always because of clear fault, but because the framework favored one side when things fell apart. The fear of false claims in domestic matters or harassment added another barrier because even defending against them drained resources, time, and reputation, regardless of the final outcome. These realities did not exist in isolation. They combined with the everyday experience of pursuing connections where initial interest faded quickly after a few months, leaving men to restart the entire process of building rapport, planning outings, and investing emotionally, only to face the same cycle again. The exhaustion from constant starting over became a heavy weight because each attempt required fresh energy at a time when basic survival already demanded multiple jobs or side work just to keep a roof and food on the table. Men in average situations calculated that the bandwidth simply did not stretch far enough to cover both keeping their heads above water and chasing compatibility that often proved temporary. This practical math pushed many toward a quieter existence where they controlled their schedules and spending without external judgment or sudden disruptions. They focused on routines that delivered steady progress, like consistent training building skills, or advancing in careers that rewarded reliability over charisma. In those spaces, they regained a sense of mastery that relationships had started to erode through mismatched expectations and one sided emotional labor. Women, meanwhile, expressed growing frustration as the landscape shifted and their usual pathways to connection narrowed. They spoke about wanting men to lead with clear plans and traditional gestures, yet the responses often came back neutral or minimal because men had internalized the lessons of previous decades where such efforts went unappreciated or were reframed as outdated pressure. The push for equality in some areas, like splitting costs or shared decision making, clashed with lingering desires for chivalry and provision, creating confusion on both ends. Men saw the inconsistency and chose not to navigate it anymore. They let the independence narrative stand and redirected their focus inward, where results felt predictable and rewarding rather than conditional on someone else's shifting standards. The cultural emphasis on female empowerment had encouraged women to prioritize careers and personal freedom during their younger years, which delivered accomplishments and autonomy, but also delayed the formation of stable partnerships for many. As time moved forward, the natural dynamics of attraction and compatibility revealed themselves more clearly, with men often maintaining or increasing their appeal through maturity and achievement, while women faced steeper competition from newer generations entering the scene. This shift became evident in how options changed over the years. Women who had enjoyed broad attention in their 20s found the volume decreasing in their 30s and beyond, not out of malice, but because supply and demand adjusted to age fertility signals and life priorities. Men who remained single or divorced started favoring partners who brought complementary traits like agreeableness and a focus on shared home life rather than continued emphasis on individual independence that sometimes translated into resistance against joint routines. The result was a growing gap where women reflected on past choices involving casual connections or high career investment and realized the trade offs carried heavier long term costs than anticipated. Loneliness crept in during quiet evenings or holidays when the absence of consistent companionship highlighted the limits of self sufficiency for deep emotional needs. Men on their side reported different outcomes because their withdrawal allowed them to cultivate fulfillment through male friendships, hobbies, and self directed goals that did not require constant negotiation. They avoided the pattern where arguments relied more on emotional intensity than shared facts, leaving one party energized and the other depleted. Instead, they channeled energy into areas that produced visible improvements in health, finances, or knowledge which reinforced their decision daily. The peace they found came from removing the uncertainty of modern courtship, where apps and social dynamics turned interactions into performance reviews rather than natural building of trust. Many described feeling liberated once they stopped measuring their worth through pursuit success and started valuing their own time as the limited resource it truly is. This mindset spread through observation as younger men witnessed the experiences of those ahead of them and adjusted their own paths accordingly, choosing caution and self investment over repeated exposure to unbalanced risks. The economic pressures of recent years amplified these choices. Inflation raised the baseline costs of housing, transportation, and daily needs, making every additional expense in dating feel heavier for men already stretched by multiple income streams. Women who had structured their lives around dual contributions or external support systems encountered tighter budgets when those elements were absent or reduced. The practical burdens of managing a household or raising children without shared labor became more apparent as years accumulated and energy levels adjusted to solo routines. Men recognized these realities but felt no drive to re enter as the default provider because earlier cultural messages had labeled that role as problematic or unnecessary. They kept their resources directed toward personal buffers against uncertainty rather than risking them in setups that offered limited legal or social protections. This self protection extended to physical intimacy as well, where the surrounding context of potential accusations or changing terms turned what was once a mutual bond into something approached with greater wariness or set aside in favor of lower risk outlets. Public behaviors reflected the broader retreat. Men reduced time in venues where casual approaches once occurred because the potential for misinterpretation outweighed any reward, especially after years of campaigns that framed normal male initiative as intrusive. They built alternative social circles around shared interests or online communities that allowed genuine exchange without the layers of filtering and defense that mixed settings often required. Women noticed the quieter atmosphere in bars, coffee shops, and events and wondered about the lack of engagement. But the groundwork for that silence had been laid through repeated framing of men as needing to step back or prove harmlessness at every turn. Men took the cues seriously and created distance that preserved their mental space. They focused on environments where they could relax fully without scanning for hidden expectations or sudden shifts in tone. This strategic withdrawal created space for personal growth that many described as more sustainable than the old pursuit model, which demanded constant adaptation to evolving rules. The storytelling of these changes reveals a chain reaction that started with legitimate calls for fairness, but evolved into patterns that discouraged mutual investment. Early efforts to address imbalances opened opportunities in education and work, which benefited many women in building independence. Yet the accompanying narratives sometimes positioned men as obstacles rather than collaborators, which over time fostered suspicion on both sides. Dating technology accelerated the process by giving instant access to options that encouraged quick judgments and reduced patience for the slower work of compatibility testing through real life interactions. Women often received high volumes of attention, which set expectations for constant validation, while men faced higher rejection rates that accumulated into fatigue. The cycle reinforced itself as each side adapted to the signals the other sent. Women emphasized strength and self reliance, which men respected by stepping aside. Men emphasized self preservation, which left gaps that women later felt in daily life when support structures proved insufficient for all needs. As women reached stages where family and partnership gained priority, the market dynamics had already shifted toward men who either disengaged entirely or sought matches with women from backgrounds that preserved more complementary roles without the accumulated distrust. Those cross cultural connections sometimes succeeded because expectations aligned around support femininity and shared purpose rather than competing independences. Back in Western contexts, the foundational trust had eroded too far for easy repair. Men had internalized the risks of commitment, including financial exposure, emotional drain, and legal vulnerabilities that made even promising connections feel like potential setups for loss. They chose solitude not as defeat, but as the rational path when the alternative offered diminishing returns. Women confronted with this reality sometimes expressed shock or frustration, pointing to the absence of traditional gestures or initiative, but the responses remained consistent because men had moved past the point of proving value through performance in a system that rewarded caution instead. This disengagement carries wider effects on society as fewer stable pairings form and birth rates reflect the hesitation around long term family building under current conditions. Communities feel the impact through changing household structures and economic models that once assumed combined contributions now adjust to higher numbers of single person units. Men who opted out report steadier mental health and focus because they eliminated the variable of navigating emotional mismatches where logic often lost to intensity, leaving exhaustion in its wake. They built lives around controllable elements that delivered compounding benefits over time. Women navigate their own adjustments as independence meets the practical limits of handling all aspects of adult life without consistent partnership. The sobering element is how both sides followed cultural directions that seemed progressive at the time, but produced outcomes that left gaps in human connection, which neither fully anticipated. Men found ways to fill their gaps through self directed purpose, while many women discovered that certain emotional and logistical needs persist regardless of career achievements or social circles. The raw truth here is that men reached a threshold where the cumulative weight of unbalanced expectations, risks, and effort without matching reciprocity made continued participation unsustainable for their well being. They did not announce it with fanfare or demands for change. They simply adjusted their behavior in quiet numbers until the pattern became obvious. Women who once celebrated stepping away from traditional roles now encounter the downstream results when those roles are no longer offered as defaults. The independence that solved immediate survival questions did not resolve the deeper desire for reliable companionship during challenging periods, or the practical sharing of responsibilities that lightens daily loads. Men watched the evolution and decided their energy belonged elsewhere, where it produced clearer returns and fewer threats to their stability. This choice feels permanent for many because the conditions that prompted it remain embedded in law culture and social norms without significant reversal in sight. Continuing through the layers shows how even the nice guys who once absorbed criticism and tried harder eventually hit the same wall. They faced repeated experiences where good intentions met entitlement or moving goalposts that turned effort into a losing proposition. Hypocrisy in demanding respect while offering little in return, or claiming strength yet expecting protection from discomfort, pushed them toward the same exit as others. Men across backgrounds recognized that participation in the current setup often meant accepting terms that favored one side when conflicts arose. They refused to play in games where the rules changed mid match or where accountability applied unevenly. Instead, they invested in personal boundaries that protected their peace and resources. This shift towards self respect rather than endless accommodation marked a turning point where even patient men concluded that solitude offered more dignity than conditional acceptance. The economic angle deepens the picture further as living costs continue to challenge single households on both sides. But men adapted by minimizing dependencies that could expose them to sudden losses. They directed earnings toward asset skills and buffers that served their long term security without external claims. Women who structured around career or state supports found those insufficient when inflation or job shifts hit and the absence of shared provision became tangible. The call for men to return and fill traditional functions rings against the backdrop of decades where those functions were critiqued as oppressive or optional. Men absorbed the critique and released the role, choosing instead to secure their own foundations first. This creates a landscape where reconnection would require fundamental adjustments in expectations and legal protections that have not materialized. The divide persists because the trust required for rebuilding was spent through years of adversarial framing and one sided risk allocation. Public spaces and social habits continue to reflect the withdrawal, with men favoring controlled environments or solo pursuits that avoid the minefield of potential misread signals. They engage professionally but keep personal layers minimal to reduce exposure. Women note the change in atmosphere and initiative levels, but the underlying causes trace back to accumulated experiences where approaches led to rejection drama or accusations that deterred future attempts. Men learned from collective observations and chose safety and distance over repeated testing of uncertain waters. The result is fewer organic connections, which reinforces the pattern for both sides. Men gain focus in their chosen paths, while women confront the reality of reduced male engagement in everyday settings. This new normal stems from rational responses to the environment rather than sudden disinterest. Men calculated the costs in time, energy, and potential fallout and found solitude the superior option for preserving their quality of life. The deeper storytelling reveals how feminism and related movements highlighted important issues around opportunity, but in their later phases sometimes discouraged the skills of compromise and mutual support that sustain relationships over decades. Women were encouraged towards self prioritization, which built resilience in certain areas, but left others underdeveloped when partnership became desirable. Men absorbed messages that questioned their contributions and instincts, leading them to withdraw those elements and redirect towards self reliance. The sexual and dating revolutions added layers by normalizing casual exploration that, for some, created emotional patterns harder to shift later while building wariness in men about investment without clear reciprocity. Technology amplified these trends, turning human connection into a filtered marketplace where quick dismissals replace gradual discovery. Each element compounded until men as a group reached the conclusion that the overall equation no longer favored their participation. They walked away toward lives of greater control and less drama, finding that the peace delivered consistent value that the old dynamic had stopped providing. This permanent separation in Western society shows no quick reversal because the foundational elements of distrust and mismatched incentives remain. Men who still seek companionship often explore options in regions where cultural development preserved more balanced views on gender roles, with women raised to value support, family, and femininity alongside strength. Those matches can form stable bonds because they avoid the accumulated poison of suspicion and entitlement that marks much of the domestic scene. Here at home, the well has run dry for trust, and without it, attempts at rebuilding feel futile to most men who have already invested years in creating better alternatives for themselves. The sobering wake up call lands hardest on those who thought the changes were superficial or temporary. The damage runs structural, and men have adapted in ways that prioritize their survival and sanity over returning to a battlefield disguised as partnership. They found real freedom in the exit, and they guard it because the alternative proved too costly in too many documented cases. Women facing economic and emotional pressures in this environment sometimes voice the desire for men to step back into provider or emotional roles, but the responses stay muted because men have internalized the full history of how those roles were received and later discarded when convenient. They refuse to become the fix for outcomes that followed from collective choices emphasizing independence above connection. The loneliness that surfaces for many women during routine days or milestones stems from the gap between celebrated autonomy and the human need for reliable shared life. Men experience less of that particular strain because their adaptations filled the space with purposeful activity and low maintenance fulfillment. The contrast highlights how the cultural signals landed differently, creating divergent paths that now feel entrenched. Men are not returning in large numbers because the peace they secured outweighs the uncertainties of re engagement under unchanged conditions. This is the straightforward reality that defines the current era between men and women in the West. The relationship as previously understood has ended, and men have built new foundations that serve them without the old burdens. The intensity of the shift becomes clearer when examining how even basic interactions carry different weights now. Women may seek validation or leadership in dating scenarios, while men have grown accustomed to environments where they set the terms without external testing. The mismatch leads to frustration on one side and disinterest on the other. Men prefer setups where compatibility shows through actions and consistency rather than words or demands. They avoid the cycle where emotional expression dominates, exchanges leaving factual resolution sidelined and energy drained. By stepping back, they protect their capacity for productive pursuits that yield measurable progress. Women who adjusted to high independence sometimes find the solo load heavier than expected when practical tasks or emotional support needs arise without a consistent partner. The economic squeeze adds weight to these dynamics as budgets tighten, and the benefits of shared resources become more evident in theory but harder to access in practice given the eroded trust. Men keep their resources close because past patterns showed the risks of sharing without safeguards that never materialized. This narrative of gradual separation tells a story of adaptation to real world incentives rather than abstract ideology. Men faced repeated signals that their efforts in courtship commitment or provision carried high downside with limited upside, and they responded by minimizing exposure. They built lives around self accountability where outcomes depended on their own actions rather than negotiation with unpredictable variables. The solitude they chose brought clarity, reduced stress, and space for growth that relationships under current norms often disrupted. Women traverse their paths with the strengths of independence, but encounter limits when deeper connection or practical partnership is absent. The divide persists because neither side has seen sufficient reason to overhaul the frameworks that led here. Men guard their peace fiercely because it was hard won through observation and experience. They see the flaws in the old model clearly and have no desire to revisit them. The West lives with the consequences of these choices as social structures adjust to lower pairing rates and shifting priorities. This remains the unvarnished truth. Men walked away, found something better, and the path forward for most stays in that direction without looking back. The hard hitting conclusion echoes through every layer of this breakdown. The bond between men and women in Western society crossed into permanent fracture when trust evaporated under decades of imbalance risk and one sided cultural pressure. Men discovered that solitude delivered the stability and respect they sought without the constant performance or potential for sudden loss. They adapted by redirecting energy towards self mastery, and the results confirmed the wisdom of the choice. Women faced the practical and emotional outcomes of paths that prioritized autonomy over balanced partnership, and many now navigate realities that feel heavier than the independence narrative suggested. Economic hardships highlight the value that shared structures once provided, but men refuse to re enter as default saviors after being told their contributions were optional or problematic. The rare connections that still form often happen outside the Western context, where different upbringings preserved complementarity without the adversarial overlay. Domestically, the ashes remain, and men have moved on to cultivate their own ground. This is not reversible in our lifetime because the foundations were scorched too thoroughly. Men mean it when they say they are done. They have peace and they are keeping it. The relationship is dead, and the wake up call is that actions over generations created this outcome with no easy bridge back. Men walked away, and Western society is living the permanent results. Men saw how survival mode swallowed their days whole, leaving almost nothing for the extra layers that dating demanded in a world where every dollar an hour counted double. They worked full shifts, then added side gigs, driving deliveries, or handling odd jobs just to cover rent utilities and basic food without falling behind on bills that kept climbing. In that grind, the idea of planning thoughtful outings, buying gifts, or investing emotional energy into building something new felt like an impossible luxury that most could not afford without risking their own stability. Women sometimes pushed for traditional gestures, like being picked up or taken out properly. But men in these tight spots had no bandwidth left after covering their own basics, and they refused to stretch themselves thinner for outcomes that carried no guarantees. The exhaustion of restarting the whole process after short relationships that lasted a year or two at best added another heavy layer because each time meant fresh first dates, new conversations, and repeated investments only to watch the connection fade when real life pressures tested it. Men began to view the entire cycle as a poor use of limited resources when they could instead direct that same effort towards strengthening their own position through consistent work skill building or simply resting enough to stay sharp for the next day. This practical reality hit hardest for average guys who never had excess cash or time to burn on repeated attempts that often ended in ghosting or sudden disinterest after initial sparks. They calculated the odds and saw slim chances of long term success even before meeting someone because the patterns around them showed relationships breaking under mismatched expectations or financial strain. Instead of forcing the issue, they chose to protect what they had built and focused on routines that delivered steady improvements without external drama. Women in their 30s and 40s started noticing the drop in genuine interest from men their age who seemed more drawn to younger options or simply content staying single. They described feeling invisible in social settings or on apps where conversations rarely led to actual plans, and they wondered why the effort from men had dried up so completely. The truth was that men had watched the market shift and adjusted their behavior to match the new risks and rewards they observed. They no longer chased with the same intensity because past experiences taught them that high investment often met low reciprocity, or quick changes in interest once daily life realities set in. The loneliness that many women described in quiet moments after long workdays or during weekends spent handling everything alone stemmed from the gap between the independence they had embraced and the human need for reliable shared support that no amount of self reliance fully replaced. They had built careers and personal routines that gave them control and achievements, but those same structures left them carrying all the mental load of decisions, planning, and emotional processing without a consistent partner to divide the weight. Some spoke about the heavy feeling of coming home to silence after handling tough days with no one there to debrief with or simply sit beside during difficult stretches. Men avoided that particular depth of isolation because their withdrawal allowed them to fill their time with purposeful activities, male friendships, or solo hobbies that recharged them without requiring constant negotiation or performance to keep someone else satisfied. They found that solitude brought a clear headed focus that chaotic dating scenes had disrupted, and they guarded that clarity because it translated into better health, better finances, and steadier progress toward their own goals. Public interactions changed dramatically as men stopped initiating in everyday venues like bars or events where approaches once happened more freely. They avoided the risk of being labeled intrusive or facing complaints that could escalate quickly in a climate where any interaction carried potential for misinterpretation or formal accusations. Women reported going long stretches without being offered a drink or engaged in casual conversation, and they attributed it to men becoming lazy or scared, but the deeper cause lay in the accumulated experiences where normal gestures led to rejection drama or worse. Men took the earlier messages about leaving women alone seriously, and they applied that boundary across the board, creating distance that preserved their peace but left social scenes quieter on the male side. They redirected their social energy toward environments where they could engage without filters or defense mechanisms. And that choice felt sustainable because it eliminated the minefield of mixed signals and shifting standards that had worn them down over years. The economic squeeze played a central role in locking this pattern in place as inflation continued to push up the baseline costs of living, making every additional expense in pursuing connections feel like a direct threat to basic security. Men who already juggled multiple income sources to stay afloat saw no logic in allocating scarce resources toward dates or gifts when those efforts frequently failed to produce lasting bonds and instead added financial pressure without matching commitment from the other side. They watched how some women maintained high standards for provision and gestures while simultaneously claiming full independence, and they decided the inconsistency made participation too one sided to justify. Women who had structured their lives around career achievements or solo management found those setups strained when unexpected costs hit or when the practical tasks of home life and daily responsibilities piled up without shared labor to lighten the load. The absence of male provision or partnership became more noticeable in tight budgets, and the calls for men to step back into traditional functions met resistance because men had absorbed the cultural critique of those roles as outdated or oppressive, and they had already redirected their efforts inward. This shift revealed itself in how even men who once tried hard to be accommodating eventually reached the same conclusion as others. They face patterns where good intentions met entitlement or arbitrary rejections that turned patience into a losing strategy. Women sometimes demanded equality in paying bills or making decisions, but still expected chivalry and leadership when it suited them, creating a moving target that frustrated consistent effort. Men stopped bending to those mixed expectations and instead set firm boundaries around their time and resources, protecting their self respect rather than continuing as doormats in setups that offered little protection when things turned difficult. They saw stories of divorces where assets and stability got divided unevenly, or where false claims in family matters drained years of progress, and they chose to avoid that gamble entirely by keeping their lives under their own control. The peace they gained from that decision reinforced itself daily as they experienced fewer conflicts, better sleep, and clearer focus without the emotional overhead of navigating unpredictable dynamics. Women over 40 often describe the dating scene as particularly harsh because their options narrowed, while men their age maintained broader choices or simply opted out altogether. They invested in self improvement, like gym routines or procedures to stay competitive, but found that the market valued youth and different traits more heavily than the independence they had cultivated. Some expressed confusion over why men seemed content with minimal effort or why conversations on apps rarely progressed to real meetings, and they pointed to male laziness as the cause. The reality involved supply and demand, adjusting to biological and social signals, where men who still participated often preferred partners without the accumulated history of high standards or casual phases that made trust harder to establish later. Men had learned from observing the patterns that investing deeply carried risks of being viewed as temporary or secondary once better options appeared, and they refused to play supporting roles in someone else's story. They prioritized their own value and directed energy toward building stability that served them first rather than proving themselves endlessly in a system stacked with downsides. The hypocrisy and expectations stood out clearly as women celebrated strength and autonomy, yet still voiced desires for men to handle traditional tasks like yard work or planning without reciprocal adjustments in other areas. Men noticed this gap and decided against fulfilling one sided requests that treated them as convenient fixes rather than equal partners. They dropped the old scripts of constant pursuit and instead focused on lives where their contributions went toward personal advancement or secure routines that no one could claim or disrupt suddenly. This choice felt like a quiet victory because it restored dignity and control that years of performance had eroded. Women confronted with the resulting silence sometimes reacted with frustration or tears when their own standards got reflected back. But men held the line, refusing to re enter games where the rules favored short term gains over long term mutual respect. They celebrated the end of the princess treatment era because it had been killed by the very attitudes that demanded it without offering balance in return. Broader societal patterns showed the impact through lower rates of family formation and shifting household structures as fewer men committed under conditions that felt rigged against their long term security. Communities adjusted to more single person units with economic models reflecting the change in combined contributions. Men reported higher satisfaction in their daily lives because they eliminated the variable of emotional mismatches, where arguments stayed rooted in intensity rather than resolution, leaving one side drained and the other validated without closure. They channeled that saved energy into fitness career growth or hobbies that produce tangible results and compounding benefits over time. Women navigated their paths with the advantages of independence, but encountered practical limits when handling all aspects of adult responsibility without consistent backup during tough periods or routine maintenance. The contrast between the two experiences highlighted how cultural directions created divergent outcomes, with men finding sustainable fulfillment through self direction, while many women faced heavier, solitary loads than the empowerment narrative had prepared them for. The risks in family and legal frameworks added another layer that made commitment feel like emotional and financial suicide for men who had witnessed peers lose access to children assets or stability after splits that favored one side regardless of contributions. They refused to enter contracts where the downside outweighed any upside and instead built personal buffers that protected against uncertainty without external claims on their earnings or time. Women who had treated partners as providers rather than equals in tough times, like job loss, found themselves facing the consequences when men stopped offering that role after seeing it weaponized or discarded. Men across backgrounds recognized the patterns and chose self respect over continued accommodation, deciding that solitude offered more dignity than conditional acceptance in unbalanced setups. They walked away silently without explanation because the game had revealed itself as rigged and they had no interest in playing anymore. This movement toward disengagement spread through observation as younger men witnessed the experiences of those ahead and adjusted early by focusing on caution and self investment rather than default pursuit. They saw relationships around them falter under unrealistic expectations or emotional imbalances, and they decided to safeguard their futures by keeping options open without heavy commitments. Dating became a low priority activity rather than a central life stage, and marriage appeared as a high risk venture instead of a natural progression. The mindset grew organically through shared realities rather than organized calls to action. Women on their side dealt with a market where male initiative had declined sharply and options felt thinner, especially as age and life choices accumulated. Biological realities and shifting priorities created urgency that sometimes clashed with earlier assurances of endless time and unlimited choices. Some adapted by reflecting on patterns or adjusting demands, but others held to the old frameworks, wondering why engagement remained so limited. Men had simply moved on building lives that no longer centered on validation or pursuit, and that shift felt permanent because the incentives driving it stayed firmly in place. The storytelling of this evolution traces back to how movements for opportunity opened doors, but later phases sometimes discouraged the mutual skills of compromise and support that keep bonds strong across decades. Women received encouragement towards self focus, which built certain resiliences, but left gaps when partnership emerged as a need later on. Men internalize questions about their instincts and contributions, leading them to withdraw those elements and redirect fully toward personal reliance. The changes in intimacy and dating norms added complications by normalizing exploration that for some created patterns difficult to transition out of while fostering caution in men about deep investment without clear returns. Technology sped everything up, turning connections into quick judgments rather than gradual trust building through shared experiences. Each factor layered onto the others until men collectively determined that the overall balance no longer supported their active participation. They stepped back toward lives of greater autonomy and reduced complications, finding that the resulting calm delivered consistent value the previous setup had stopped providing reliably. This separation in Western context shows little sign of quick repair because the core elements of eroded trust and uneven incentives remain embedded without major shifts in law or culture to address them. Men who maintain interest in companionship frequently look toward regions where different cultural foundations preserved complementary dynamics, with women bringing support and family focus alongside their strengths. Those connections can develop stability because they sidestep the layers of suspicion and one sided demands that characterize much of the local scene. Domestically, the foundation feels too damaged for straightforward rebuilding, and men who have already invested in alternatives see no compelling reason to risk what they have gained. The sobering element lands in recognizing that both sides followed paths that seemed forward thinking at the outset, but produced divides that now feel structural. Men secured peace through strategic retreat, and they maintain it because the alternative carried too many documented costs in stability and well being. Women encounter the practical results of prioritizing autonomy without fully balancing the relational aspects that provide deeper fulfillment for many over time. The economic and emotional pressures only highlight the trade offs more sharply as years progress. The raw intensity of the change comes through in how basic daily choices now reflect deeper calculations. Men favor controlled settings or independent routines that avoid potential for sudden escalations or misread intentions in mixed company. They engage where necessary, but keep personal boundaries tight to minimize exposure to dynamics that previously drained them without adequate reward. Women note the quieter engagement and reduced initiative, but the cause is traced to years of accumulated experiences where normal behaviors led to defensive responses or accusations that deterred future efforts. Men learned the lessons collectively and responded with distance that protected their mental resources. The outcome is fewer casual connections, which solidifies tester the pattern for everyone involved. Men gain steadier progress in their chosen directions, while women adjust to realities where male participation in everyday social or romantic spheres has become minimal. This new baseline resulted from logical adaptations to the environment rather than abrupt disinterest, and it holds because the underlying conditions have not eased. Men who once fit the nice guy profile rejected the role after seeing it lead to disrespect or being taken for granted in setups that demanded endless patience without reciprocity. They stopped offering unearned chivalry or bending to guilt when their own needs went unacknowledged. Stories circulated of men calmly stating their boundaries or walking away from interactions that revealed hypocrisy, like demanding treatment while offering none in return. Women sometimes reacted with surprise or emotion when the mirror reflected their standards back. But men remained firm, refusing to re engage in cycles that favored short term validation over mutual accountability. They viewed themselves as bringing value through stability and effort, and they required proof of matching contributions before investing. The Princess era ended not through declaration, but through the collective male decision to stop funding it without balance, and women faced the adjustment period where old expectations met new realities of self sufficiency in all areas. The hard conclusion that cuts through the noise is that men have permanently altered their approach because the cost finally outweighed any perceived benefits in the current Western framework. They discovered that directing energy inward produced reliable peace and progress, that external pursuits rarely matched under the prevailing conditions. Women confront the outcomes of choices that emphasized independence and personal achievement, which delivered freedom in select domains, but left voids in companionship and shared practical support that became more evident with time. Economic strains make the absence of traditional partnership structures felt more acutely. But men hold their position because earlier critiques labeled those structures as problematic, and they adapted by releasing them entirely. The trust required for reconnection eroded too thoroughly through adversarial patterns and risk imbalances that no surface appeals can restore quickly. Men mean their withdrawal, and the peace they secured keeps them committed to it. The relationship landscape, as it once functioned, has ended, and the wake up remains that decades of collective decisions created this lasting divide with no simple path across it in our era. Men walked away, found solid ground on their own terms, and Western society continues adjusting to the permanent shift. Men witnessed the financial tightrope that defined daily existence for most average guys and decided the added weight of courtship expenses simply did not fit into their budgets anymore. Rent, gas, groceries, and unexpected repairs already consumed every paycheck with little left over even after picking up extra shifts or weekend work. Dating required not just time, but actual cash for meals, activities, and small gestures that once seemed standard, but now felt like throwing money into a black hole with no reliable return. Men in their 30s and 40s who balanced multiple responsibilities saw how quickly those costs added up across repeated attempts, and they refused to keep funding cycles that often ended after a short period, leaving them back at square one with depleted savings. They chose instead to allocate every dollar toward building their own emergency funds or improving their living situations because those investments delivered security that no uncertain connection could match. Women sometimes still expected the full traditional package of planned outings and covering costs, but men had watched the independence narrative play out long enough to recognize that equality in theory rarely translated to shared expenses in practice. They stopped stretching themselves thin and focused on covering their own needs first, which gave them breathing room. They had lacked in previous years of trying to balance everything at once. The repeated cycle of investing in new connections only to watch them dissolve after 1 or 2 years created a pattern of emotional and logistical reset that wore men down to the point of permanent caution. Each fresh start meant learning habits, preferences, and boundaries all over again, while navigating the early stages where compatibility remained untested and expectations ran high. Men described the process as exhausting because it demanded performing in ways that did not align with their natural routines, such as planning activities they would never choose for themselves or maintaining constant availability during uncertain phases. After enough rounds, they began to view the entire endeavor as inefficient when the odds of lasting success appeared low from the outset based on observed patterns around them. Instead, they directed that same energy toward consistent habits like regular training or skill development that produce steady, measurable gains without the risk of sudden abandonment or mismatched effort. Women who had enjoyed broader attention in earlier years started to feel the slowdown as men collectively reduced their pursuit, and many expressed confusion over why conversations stalled or plans never materialized. The underlying cause lay in men protecting their limited resources after calculating that the juice rarely justified the squeeze in an environment where short term connections dominated and long term stability felt increasingly rare. Loneliness surfaced for many women during ordinary evenings after completing work and errands when the absence of a steady presence turned quiet moments into heavy ones. They handled full days of responsibilities, yet found themselves carrying the mental checklist alone without someone to share the load or simply decompress with at the end. The independence that provided control during younger phases delivered less comfort as routines settled into solitary patterns, and the desire for reliable companionship grew without easy fulfillment. Men avoided sinking into similar isolation because their deliberate withdrawal opened space for fulfilling activities and connections with other men that required far less emotional overhead. They built days around training sessions, personal projects, or low maintenance friendships that recharged them consistently and left them feeling capable rather than drained. This difference in daily experience reinforced the choice for men because solitude under their control brought clarity and progress, while the alternative often introduced variables that disrupted focus and stability. Social venues transformed as men reduced their presence in places where casual interactions once flowed more naturally. They avoided bars, clubs, and mixed events because the potential for misread signals or defensive reactions created unnecessary tension that outweighed any possible upside. Women noted the change in atmosphere, reporting longer stretches without being approached or engaged in light conversation. And they sometimes attributed it to men losing interest or confidence. The real driver came from years of accumulated caution, where normal gestures carried elevated risks of being framed negatively or leading to uncomfortable escalations. Men responded by creating their own circles around shared interests or home based routines where they could relax fully without scanning for hidden pitfalls. They engaged when necessary in professional or neutral settings, but kept personal layers minimal to preserve their energy for priorities that actually advanced their lives. This strategic distance allowed them to maintain dignity and control rather than repeatedly testing waters that had proven unpredictable and often unrewarding. Economic pressures locked the pattern deeper because inflation continued raising the floor for basic survival, making every discretionary spend feel like a direct threat to staying afloat. Men who already managed tight budgets saw dating as an unnecessary variable that could tip the scales toward debt or skip essentials. They watched how some expectations still leaned toward men covering costs despite claims of full equality, and they decided the imbalance made participation illogical. Women who structured around career paths or solo management encountered their own strains when household tasks or unexpected bills piled up without the buffer of shared resources. The practical weight of going it alone became more evident over time, and calls for men to resume traditional support met firm resistance because men had already redirected their efforts toward personal security that no one else could claim. They kept earnings close, building buffers against uncertainty, and refused to risk them in setups where legal or social protections remained uneven. Even men known for patience and accommodation reached the same boundary after encountering patterns of disrespect or one sided demands that turned goodwill into a liability. They faced situations where efforts to be understanding met entitlement or sudden shifts that left them feeling used rather than valued. Women occasionally highlighted desires for leadership and gestures, while simultaneously pushing narratives that downplayed the need for men in other areas, creating contradictions that frustrated consistent investment. Men stopped navigating those mixed messages and established clear limits around their time and contributions, protecting their self worth instead of continuing as default supporters in unbalanced arrangements. They observed outcomes where commitment led to asset division or restricted access to family and separations, and they chose to safeguard what they built by keeping their lives under direct control. The resulting peace confirmed the decision daily as conflicts decreased and focus sharpened without the constant adjustment to someone else's fluctuating standards. Women in their 40s and beyond often describe the dating environment as particularly challenging because attention that once came easily diminished, while competition from younger entrants kept the pool dynamic. They invested in maintenance and self presentation, yet found that the broader market responded more to youth and different signals than to the independence they had cultivated. Some voiced frustration over reduced initiative from men their age who either pursued other options or simply stayed content with single life. Men in similar age groups maintained appeal through stability and maturity, but many directed it toward partners whose values aligned with complementarity rather than continued emphasis on autonomy that sometimes resisted joint routines. The supply and demand realities adjusted naturally as biological and social factors influenced choices, and men who remained active often favored connections unburdened by heavy histories of high expectations or casual phases that complicated trust building later. They calculated that deep investment carried risks of secondary positioning once newer possibilities appeared, and they refused to occupy supporting roles in dynamics that lacked mutual priority. The inconsistency in expectation stood out when women celebrated strength and self sufficiency, yet still voiced needs for men to handle certain traditional elements without adjusting their own contributions accordingly. Men recognized the gap and declined to fulfill requests that positioned them as convenient solutions rather than equal participants. They released the old patterns of endless pursuit and instead concentrated on paths where their value served their own advancement and security. This adjustment restored a sense of agency that years of performance had gradually eroded, and it felt sustainable because results depended on their direct actions rather than negotiation with unpredictable elements. Women encountering the quieter response sometimes reacted with surprise when their standards reflected back, but men maintained their position, refusing to restart cycles that favored temporary validation over balanced accountability. The era of one sided treatment ended through the collective choice to stop subsidizing it without reciprocity, and women adjusted to realities where self management extended across all domains. Societal ripples appeared through declining family formation rates and evolving household compositions as fewer men entered long term commitments under conditions that felt stacked against their security. Communities adapted to higher numbers of independent units with economic assumptions shifting away from combined incomes toward individual resilience. Men described improved daily satisfaction because they removed the element of emotional mismatches, where exchanges often stayed anchored in intensity, leaving resolution elusive and energy depleted. They applied saved capacity to physical improvement career steps or interests that generated clear benefits, accumulating over months and years. Women managed their trajectories with the strengths of autonomy, but confronted logistical ceilings when every responsibility from maintenance to planning rested solely on their shoulders, without steady backup during routine or challenging periods. The contrast illustrated how earlier cultural signals produced different long term results, with men securing reliable fulfillment through self direction, while many women carried heavier, solitary burdens than anticipated. Risks embedded in family and legal structures added weight that made formal commitment appear as a potential threat to everything men had accumulated. They witnessed arrangements where separations divided assets unevenly or limited parental involvement despite prior investments, and they declined to enter agreements with such pronounced downsides. Men across different backgrounds absorbed the patterns and prioritized self protection over continued participation, deciding that controlled solitude preserved more dignity than conditional roles in setups that offered limited safeguards. They stepped back without fanfare because the structure had revealed itself as favoring short term advantages over enduring mutual benefit, and they saw no value in engaging further. Younger men observed these realities early and calibrated their own approaches toward caution and personal development rather than default progression into relationships that carried heavy exposure. The evolution traced through cultural movements that addressed opportunity gaps, but in later stages sometimes undervalued the relational skills of compromise and sustained support essential for lasting bonds. Women gained encouragement toward personal focus, which strengthened certain capabilities but created voids when partnership desires surfaced later. Men internalize critiques of their instincts and roles, leading them to withdraw those contributions and channel fully into independent foundations. Changes in social and intimacy norms complicated transitions by normalizing exploration that left some with patterns resistant to deeper commitment, while heightening caution among men about investment without visible reciprocity. Technology accelerated judgments, turning potential connections into rapid evaluations rather than organic trust development through shared time. These layers accumulated until men determined the aggregate equation no longer justified active involvement, and they redirected toward lives emphasizing autonomy and reduced complications, where calm became a consistent asset. The separation within Western contexts persists without immediate repair because core issues of diminished trust and asymmetric incentives stay rooted in institutions and norms without fundamental corrections. Men interested in companionship increasingly explore settings where cultural foundations support complementary dynamics, with women oriented toward support and family alongside personal strengths. Those pairings can develop durability because they bypass layers of accumulated suspicion and demands that mark much of the domestic environment. Locally, the base feels too compromised for straightforward reconstruction, and men who invested in alternatives recognize little incentive to hazard their gains. The wake up element emerges in acknowledging that both trajectories followed directions that appeared progressive initially, but generated structural divides now difficult to bridge. Men attain peace through measured retreat, and they sustain it because alternatives demonstrated excessive cost in stability and mental resources. Women encounter practical and relational consequences of pathways prioritizing self reliance without fully integrating the connective aspects that provide sustained fulfillment for many across time. Economic strains sharpen the visibility of those trade offs as periods lengthen. Daily choices now mirror deeper assessments as men select environments and routines that minimize exposure to escalations or misinterpretations in mixed company. They participate where required, but maintain tight personal limits to conserve resources for directions that advance their position. Women observe the reduced engagement and lower initiative, but causes link back to accumulated experiences where standard behaviors triggered defensive postures or complaints that discouraged repetition. Men internalized the collective lessons and responded with distance that safeguarded their capacity. The outcome involves fewer spontaneous connections, which cements the baseline for all parties. Men achieve steadier advancement in chosen areas, while women adapt to landscapes where male involvement in routine social or romantic context has contracted significantly. This adjusted standard arose from pragmatic responses to surrounding conditions rather than sudden indifference, and it endures because foundational elements have not relaxed. Men previously identified as accommodating rejected that label after repeated instances where it invited disregard or exploitation in arrangements demanding unlimited tolerance without equivalent return. They ceased providing unearned gestures or yielding to pressure when their requirements went unaddressed. Accounts emerged of men stating limits plainly or disengaging from exchanges, revealing double standards, such as expecting treatment while extending none. Women occasionally responded with emotion when their own approaches mirrored back, but men stayed resolute, declining to resume patterns, favoring brief affirmation over shared responsibility. They regarded themselves as contributors of stability and consistency, requiring evidence of parallel input before committing resources. The previous dynamic of preferential handling concluded not by announcement but through the group decision to halt support without equilibrium, and women confronted periods of adjustment where former assumptions met expanded self reliance demands. The central truth cutting through remains that men have fundamentally recalibrated because cumulative downsides surpassed any remaining upsides in the prevailing Western structure. They uncovered that focusing inward generated dependable calm and advancement that external engagement seldom equaled under existing circumstances. Women address results of decisions, emphasizing autonomy and accomplishments, which supplied liberty in targeted spheres but produced empty spaces in consistent companionship and divided practical duties that grew noticeable with passing time. Strains in resources make the lack of former partnership frameworks more tangible, yet men maintain stance because prior evaluations cast those frameworks as questionable, and they responded by releasing them completely. Trust necessary for reconnection diminished too extensively through oppositional patterns and uneven risk distribution that surface efforts cannot restore promptly. Men stand by their repositioning, and the calm they established keeps them anchored. The relational terrain, as formerly structured, has concluded, and the call to awareness stays that extended group choices forge this enduring split with no straightforward crossing in the current period. Men advanced to firmer territory on personal terms, and Western society keeps adapting to the fixed transition. Men examined the legal landscape surrounding family matters and realized the framework placed them at a permanent disadvantage once commitments formed. Courts often distributed assets accumulated through years of labor in ways that stripped men of equity built during the relationship while imposing ongoing payments that continued long after separation. Access to children frequently followed patterns favoring one parent, regardless of prior involvement or stability, provided leaving fathers navigating restricted time and influence under strict schedules. Men reviewed case after case where even responsible providers ended up with reduced resources and limited parental roles because the system operated with built in assumptions that favored the other side. False claims in domestic situations or custody disputes added another dimension because defending against them required significant legal costs and time, even when evidence eventually cleared the individual. These structures did not encourage mutual investment. Instead, they created an environment where men viewed formal bonds as contracts with asymmetric enforcement that could unravel everything constructed through discipline and effort. They chose to avoid entering those agreements altogether, keeping their holdings intact and their parental possibilities under their own discretion if they ever pursued that path later through different routes. The shift in public behavior extended beyond bars and clubs into workplaces and community events where men maintained strictly professional boundaries to eliminate any chance of claims arising from casual remarks or interactions. They observed how movements intended to address genuine concerns expanded into broad brushes that painted ordinary conduct as suspicious, leading to heightened scrutiny in mixed environments. Training sessions and policies emphasized caution around any personal exchange, which men interpreted as signals to minimize engagement outside required duties. This created workplaces where collaboration happened efficiently, but social layers stayed surface level, preserving focus on tasks rather than navigating potential landmines. Women sometimes commented on the cooler atmosphere or lack of informal camaraderie, but men prioritized protecting their positions and reputations over fostering deeper connections that carried unnecessary exposure. They redirected social needs towards structured activities with clear rules or virtual groups where misunderstanding stayed minimal and accountability remained shared. Younger generations absorbed these patterns through direct observation of family outcomes and peer experiences. Boys growing up witnessed fathers or uncles dealing with separations that altered financial stability, and daily involvement with children prompting early decisions to prioritize education and career foundations before considering any relational steps. They saw how social media amplified certain narratives that celebrated female autonomy while questioning male reliability, leading many to question the value of investing heavily in dynamics that appeared one sided from the start. Teens and men in their early 20s focused on building skills, trade certifications, or entry level positions that offered tangible progress rather than diverting energy into pursuits with high rejection rates and uncertain futures. Dating apps highlighted the imbalance further, with women receiving volumes of interest that allowed selective engagement while men competed in environments where responses came sporadically, if at all. This numerical reality reinforced the lesson that effort needed redirection towards self development, where returns depended on personal input rather than external validation. The emphasis on physical maintenance and appearance created additional layers of expectation that men found unsustainable in their current circumstances. Women invested significant portions of income in routines for hair, skin, and clothing to maintain a certain presentation, which they sometimes framed as necessary for confidence, yet also positioned as burdens men should help offset through provision or gifts. Men calculated that contributing to those costs represented another drain on already stretched resources without guaranteed alignment in values or long term compatibility. They preferred partners who approached life with practicality, where mutual support emerged naturally rather than through scripted gestures that felt performative. Many women reach points where the cumulative expense of sustaining that image combined with career demands left them questioning the overall strategy, especially when solitude highlighted the limits of self focused routines. Men avoided that cycle by keeping their own upkeep simple and functional, directing savings toward assets or experiences that enhanced their independence without external dependencies. Cultural narratives around strength and resilience sometimes overlooked the practical realities of managing households solo over extended periods. Women who embraced full autonomy discovered that handling repairs, scheduling appointments, and emotional processing without consistent backup added layers of fatigue that accumulated quietly. Tasks once divided in traditional setups now rested entirely on one set of shoulders, leading to burnout during peak seasons or unexpected crises. Men who stepped back from those roles did so after recognizing that their contributions had been reframed as optional or oppressive in public discourse, leading them to withdraw and focus on their own resilience instead. They built support networks through male friendships or professional services that delivered reliability without the emotional negotiations that often accompanied personal relationships. This approach provided consistency that many described as liberating because outcomes depended on planning and execution rather than hoping for reciprocity that frequently fell short. The role of technology in reshaping interactions cannot be overstated, as platforms designed for connection often amplified superficial judgments and reduced patience for gradual development of trust. Profiles and messaging turned potential matches into quick evaluations based on curated images and brief texts, leading to high volumes of superficial engagement followed by abrupt endings. Men experienced the fatigue of crafting responses only to encounter patterns of delayed replies or sudden silences that wasted hours better spent on productive activities. Women sometimes received overwhelming attention that set expectations for constant excitement, yet led to dissatisfaction when deeper compatibility proved elusive. Both sides adapted in their own ways, with men lowering overall investment to protect time and mental space, while women navigated the paradox of abundance in options coupled with scarcity in meaningful progress. The result was a dating environment where genuine effort felt mismatched against the ease of disengagement, leaving many to conclude that offline strategies or complete pauses offered better alternatives. Men who previously identified as providers and protectors released those identities after cultural critiques labeled them as outdated power structures rather than complementary strengths. They redirected that protective instinct inward, securing their own futures through diversified income streams, skill acquisition, and health maintenance that reduced vulnerability to external shocks. This self focused protection extended to avoiding situations where legal or social frameworks could reinterpret their actions negatively. Women who had advocated for reduced reliance on traditional roles now confronted the vacuum when those roles vanished entirely from the equation. The independence that solved immediate logistical challenges did not fill the space for shared decision making or mutual encouragement during setbacks. Men found satisfaction in mastering their domains where progress felt linear and controllable rather than subject to fluctuating preferences. The demographic trends emerging from these choices point toward sustained lower pairing rates as men delay or forego formal commitments in favor of lifestyles centered on personal agency. Communities experience shifts in household compositions, with more individuals managing solo economies that influence local markets for housing services and leisure. Birth rates reflect the hesitation around family formation when the surrounding incentives favor caution over expansion. Men report greater overall contentment because they eliminated variables that previously introduced unpredictability into their planning. Women adjust to environments where initiative from the other side has contracted, requiring them to either accept altered dynamics or double down on self sufficiency across all life domains. The contrast underscores how earlier signals about autonomy created uneven long term landings, with one side securing controllable fulfillment and the other navigating expanded responsibilities without matching support structures. International options for companionship highlight regional differences in cultural development, where certain societies maintained expectations around support and family orientation that align more closely with what many men seek. Women in those contexts often approach partnership with traits emphasizing cooperation and domestic harmony without the overlay of constant negotiation over roles or value. Men who pursue those paths report higher satisfaction because the foundational assumptions reduce friction around daily expectations and long term goals. Domestically, the accumulated history of suspicion and redefined norms makes similar alignment rare, leading most to conclude that rebuilding on local soil carries too much baggage for worthwhile returns. The preference for cross border matches stems from practical assessment rather than rejection of connection itself, but from recognition that compatible frameworks exist elsewhere, untainted by decades of adversarial positioning. The quiet revolution in male behavior manifests not through loud declarations, but through consistent daily choices that prioritize peace and self direction over external validation. Men curate environments where their energy flows toward outcomes they control, such as fitness regimens, side businesses, or creative pursuits that deliver intrinsic rewards. They engage society on terms that protect their boundaries, refusing to perform in arenas where rules shift without notice or accountability apply selectively. This strategic positioning has allowed many to experience reduced stress, improved focus, and a sense of mastery that chaotic relational pursuits seldom provided. Women who observe the withdrawal sometimes interpret it as disinterest or laziness, but the underlying driver remains a rational response to accumulated experiences where investment yielded diminishing returns and elevated risks. The new baseline favors those who adapt quickly to self reliant models across genders, yet the transition exposes gaps in emotional and practical support that neither side fully anticipated when the shifts began. Broader implications touch economic models that once relied on stable dual contributions or male breadwinning, now adjusting to higher proportions of independent units. Markets for certain goods and services evolve as single households prioritize convenience and personal optimization over shared family oriented spending. Social policies face pressure to address changing demographics around housing support and community resources calibrated for different household configurations. Men who opted for solitude described the experience as liberating because it removed the constant calculation of emotional labor and potential fallout, allowing clearer allocation of resources toward future security. Women encounter the the full spectrum of autonomy, which includes both the freedom of decision making and the weight of undivided responsibility during every season of life. The sobering aspect lies in how collective cultural directions intended to expand opportunities generated structural separations that now define interactions for the foreseeable future. Men who once tolerated inconsistencies in communication styles, where emotional expression dominated factual exchange, reached limits after repeated cycles left them depleted without resolution. They preferred dynamics where problems received direct attention and collaborative solutions rather than prolonged processing that energized one party while exhausting the other. By stepping away, they preserved their capacity for productive dialogue in professional or friendship contexts where reciprocity felt balanced. Women who valued verbal processing for stress relief found that solo routines still required internal management of those emotions without external outlets that previously provided relief. The mismatch in styles contributed to the overall divergence as each side optimized for what sustained their individual well being under the prevailing conditions. The finality of the divide becomes evident when examining how even attempts at surface reconciliation meet resistance rooted in past patterns. Appeals for men to re engage as providers or emotional anchors clash against the memory of those roles being critiqued and then abandoned when convenient. Men maintain their repositioning because the peace achieved through independence has proven more stable than conditional participation in frameworks that offer limited safeguards. Women face the task of either embracing expanded self management or reflecting on adjustments that might realign incentives. Yet the window for easy shifts has narrowed with time and habit, solidifying the separation. This reality serves as the unfiltered assessment of where decades of evolving norms have landed both sides, with men anchored in self mastery and the broader society adapting to reduced interdependence in personal spheres. The intensity of this transformation reveals itself through the steady accumulation of small decisions that collectively reshape daily existence. Men select routines and social circles that minimize friction and maximize control, allowing them to thrive without the overhead of navigating mismatched priorities. Women calibrate to landscapes where external initiative has receded, requiring internal resources to fill gaps in companionship and shared labor. The outcome is a Western context where relationships, as previously structured, have concluded not through dramatic confrontation, but through pragmatic withdrawal that prioritizes individual sustainability. Men have secured territory on their own terms, finding value in the clarity and autonomy that emerged from the exit. The wake up remains that the path forward involves acknowledging the permanence of these changes rather than hoping for reversal in environments where foundational trust eroded beyond quick repair. Men walked away, constructed stable ground, and show no indication of retracing steps under current conditions. If you have reached this point in the discussion, you are part of the 1 hour gang, and I appreciate you sticking with it through the full breakdown. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show some support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. Tell me in the comments what you thought about everything we covered here today, whether you agree with the points, and share your own thoughts on where this all leads. Like the video if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.